Okay, we're back, Troy. Again, this is one of the parts for me that's juicy, that's interesting, that really gets to the crux of what's going on in the world today in so many arenas. I mean, there's not much I don't think of in the world that doesn't go back to the financial system and how it's worked out and how the archetypes come into play of what the slavery is to it, or the debt, or the reasoning, the logical reasoning of why it's able to control people. So let me go back into the idea of what debt is. I know that my own personal debt at one time really had a lock on me, and I started to go in and actually look at myself. What was this about? How did it get me? Why did it get me? When I look at the amount of money that's in the world, when I look at the what happened with derivatives in the banking system, and they're talking trillions and quadrillions, possibly quadrillion dollars. Talked to a friend of mine for hours one time, almost 6 hours, about his debt and what it did to him psychologically and personally, until he got to a point where he understood what I was talking about with debt, and it actually popped him out of it. It gave him a freedom to the point where he realized that this debt wasn't really anybody's money. There can't be where did somebody come up with $250 billion to loan? Where does this worth come from? And then the realization to him was, no, this is made up. This is something somebody made up and I fell for and I'm into. But yet he did borrow the money and got something purchased from that money, and that was the lock that we had to work on. And so the psychology of that, can we talk a little bit of the psychology and then go into the history of how they, in the archetype of how they do that?
Sure. Well, in my opinion, getting somebody in debt is a hell of a lot easier than standing over them with a cudgel in order to get somebody to do something.
Isn't that the truth?
Just ask the mafia, ask anybody who really knows about controlling people and getting them to do things, get them in debt. This is the legacy that I believe has come out of the fall and I should make it clear to your listeners that I do believe there is a historical golden age, which is explained by the cosmology I put forward in the website Saturn Death Cult.
Yeah, and I want to get into that later if we can. I'd love to get into that. I want to build a foundation where people have the psychology to go, okay, now let's go to the history of it and what actually did happen that kind of started all this happening. So go ahead and continue on. Sorry for the interruption.
Well, once we accept that a golden age existed and there is a desire to get back to a golden age, and I do believe that there are people who want to go back to the concepts of a golden age that have no malevolent intentions whatsoever. There's just a deep-rooted desire. That's probably, in my opinion, where the psychological aspect actually starts, is something that is so deep-rooted, it's been passed down through generations, this desire to have something better than that which we see around us now. And, of course, this is summed up in the biblical term, by the sweat of your brow will you make the earth yield its fruits. This is the consequences of Adam and Eve being chucked out of the Garden of Eden. Where we get this debt concept, which we've discussed before, is that there is a small percentage of people who want back into what the Golden Age offered, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of material gain, in terms of spiritual authority, all these things that come with it. The consequence of that desire is to create a means by which a mechanism for placing other people at their disposal for basically bringing forth fruits of the earth. And, of course, the financial system that we have today has its legacy in this basic concept of, if I can create a money system that people will accept but issue it as a debt or with interest. Interest and debt should be interchangeable in most people's minds when it comes to finance. If I can do that, then I have the perfect mechanism by which to ensure that the productive capacity of humanity as a whole comes under my control. This is where debt comes. It is the ultimate alchemical act. People often think of alchemists as slaving over the idea of turning lead into gold. Well, I'll tell you what, turning somebody's claim to authority into productive work from other people by issuing money is the ultimate alchemical act that I know of, and is probably the most occultic, concept or ritual. It's forget about the blood sacrifices for the time being. Forget about the horror stories that have come down to us from various cultures, whether it's human sacrifice in Mesoamerica, the Druids in Britain, and whatever. The greatest occult act ever perpetrated is this idea of issuing money as a debt, so that a few benefit from the productive capacity of all, without having to do any work themselves.
That's a powerful statement, and when you first started saying it a minute ago, it hit me at a deep level, because to me, as I've looked at that, the only place it exists in the universe is in the mind of man.
Absolutely. It's an incredible concept, which I've always described it as, if I create $10 worth of notes, 10 notes, they have these little incantations written all over them, little symbols and things like that, and I issue that to you and say that is money, and you agree that it is money, but I then say at the end of the year I want 11 of them back. All right? I've just asked you to do the impossible. The only way that somebody can do that would be to forge or counterfeit one of those notes, which, as we know, is one of the defense mechanisms of the finance system. Nobody can go out and do that without getting themselves into trouble. So if I make a law based on that, but still demand I want 11 of those notes back, even though I've only given you 10, oh boy, it's incredible that people fall for this. But we have.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking of, and I'm using this in psychological terms instead of browbeating people with it, but the first commandment is, thou shalt put no other gods before me. If we put it into the idea that you're making an agreement that you will create something that's impossible to create, and only God can do that.
Yes, particularly also something that you're going to put all your faith in.
Yeah.
As a means for your what you would call for the benefit of yourself and so on. You get to the point where you start asking God to provide you with the thing that you really trust, money.
In trust in money, but also it seems like you're saying that with that dynamic that's happening, that you are God in yourself, because you've agreed to something that you can't do, that based on the fact that all creation is in existence, that we are now going to create something. But it seems like the first line of demarcation or bifurcation away from our flow with the universe, with spirit, with the divine, with God, whatever way you want to put it, that you're actually now, you've created something that doesn't exist, that in an opening, which then pulls you away. It's the first act of pulling you away from lining up with spirit, with creator.
Yeah, absolutely. This takes us back into really coming to an understanding that if we accept there was a golden age, there's an argument for explaining that on a natural history sort of level. But if we accept there was a golden age, then we have to ask, what was the nature of the golden age and what really brought it to an end in terms of the effect on humans and such.
Beautiful.
Now, this comes back, in the Judeo-Christian tradition. This alludes to the fall of Adam and Eve, the famous, eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Sure.
And then, of course, we look at the consequences of that. It means they lose access to the benefits that were the Garden of Eden, stroke the golden age of that time. And subsequently, from that point in time, we come back to our thesis that there has been an attempt to almost artificially recreate a golden age situation, but that only a small elite ever benefit in the way that everybody benefited back in this supposed golden age. That, of course, is our debt system. So the fall of Adam and Eve is basically a rejection of a way of doing things as it was done in the golden age in favor of Adam and Eve's own, personal ideas on how to run the show.
This is the foundation, the crux, the apex of everything that you're talking about. This point of again, bifurcation from the golden age and how it falls, then everything falls apart, and then how a new system is being built to try to enter back into that artificially, in a sense.
Yeah, and being built by man. That's the key element here. When we look at some of the religious interpretations and so on, it's mankind's efforts himself, to rebuild this golden age. Okay.
Gotcha. So it's a faith in man. Man is God, not in the connection.
Absolutely.
Okay. So the fall then. Can we talk about the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Do you have anything on that? What was that tree of knowledge of good and evil that they ate from that kind of pulled them out of that created this mess that we're in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I say, this is fundamental to this understanding, and for most people and listeners that we'd have, they know enough about this particular tradition to get a grasp on this. But the nature of the Golden Age, the Garden of Eden, is this insular place where mankind, represented by the character Adam and his wife Eve, wanted for nothing. Now, the tree of knowledge of good and evil denotes, by implication, the concept called the rule of law. All right? So it's a tree from which good and evil the knowledge of good and evil can be gained, and the only way that people know the difference between good and evil is through the concept of law. It's something that tells you that you can't do this or you can do this, and so on. It's a line in the sand, so to speak, that we're talking about here. Now, when I look at the traditions of the Golden Age from other mythologies, what is so important here, and I know many Christians will find this very difficult to stomach, but just bear with me in terms for the sake of illustration. But if you substitute Yahweh, the God of Genesis chapter 1 through to 3, for Saturn, in terms of who rules, when we look at this at the concept of Saturn, what we find is that Saturn is the god of time. And this is crucial in understanding what the Golden Age meant to humanity. We have a tendency to think of a Golden Age and even the Garden of Eden as just simply a time of lack of want. You didn't have to do any work. There was no worry where your food was coming from. All this sort of thing, this idea of blissful ignorance without challenge from the environment. My understanding is that this is not the case. What happens in the Golden Age and also in the Garden of Eden is that concept of making measure, which is what is implied by Saturn being the god of time, i.e. the ability to measure time, implies the first time that humans are given the ability to measure their environment, to create weights and measures and so on, to get a handle on describing their environment. And the next step in weights and measures, of course, is to establish a benchmark for those weights and measures so that it can be understood by anybody who uses these weights and measures. They get a consistent outcome from using these measures. Now, without getting too complicated, where this actually leads to is the idea of the rule of law, where law becomes the basic means by which humans interact with their environment and interact with each other. Of course, the advent of discovering the ability to calculate time is the basis that leads to this concept of the rule of law. So the tree of knowledge of good and evil is a symbol for the idea that law or the rule of law exists, and exists under the auspices of the God that created it. In the Bible, that is the God Yahweh. In mythology, that is Saturn or Kronos and various other sort of ideas. Yes. Now, when we look at the statement made by Eve in relation to the temptation by the enchanter, I don't like to use the word serpent. It's not there in the original Hebrew, but the enchanting voice of this character that convinces her that if she eats of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, she will become as like a god. And that word God, Elohim, can also be translated as judge, and judges are people who arbitrate law. Okay? So essentially speaking, what I believe has happened here is that there is a desire on the part of the woman and ultimately the man to eat, meaning to partake in the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so that they could become as God in judging, in making up their own judgments, in creating their own laws. And so here we have the eternal conflict. You have God's law on one hand, which is considered perfect, but you also have man's law, which is in opposition to God's law, and it begins with this eating, which in biblical terminology, to eat of something means to partake, means to engage in. You've eaten of the fruits of the other nations. All this sort of stuff. It's a symbolic Hebrew idiom for engaging in. So basically, Adam and Eve engaged in creating their own laws. This is my understanding of what went on, based on the fact that it seems to be a constant of the other mythologies as well, this idea that mankind decides to take hold of his own destiny by creating his own laws and not following the laws of the Creator God. Hence the conflict, hence the end of the Golden Age, because mankind has now placed himself under his own system of judgment. And the consequences of that system of judgment have come down through the ages in terms of this tradition in the form of a humanity that basically is destroying itself and needs to be quite literally bailed out by the God of creation with the original perfect set of laws. Make sense?
Oh, I've had a tremendous shift just listening to that. Psychological, some kind of shift has happened there, because I've searched for the knowledge of the tree of the fruit of good. I'm saying it wrong because I'm kind of like my brain is shifted. The closest I ever got in the past was listening to somebody where I had a similar shift. He said it was doubting God, and they just determined that they now were going to be the judge of what good was, what evil was, which goes exactly into what you're saying. You just gave a
precisely
more historical perspective, which then seems to me, based on what you just said, they are now not within the rule of law, the measure of law. They are determining situational ethics, what their own rule of law is, and then they're poisoning, so to speak, the well of what the real law of weights and measures is.
Yeah, they're creating a man-made system of weights and measures. And when you look into biblical law in particular, there is an absolute prohibition against having what's called diverse weights and measures, or unequal weights and measures. And of course, probably the most sinister form of unequal weight to measure is money. When you issue it as a debt, it becomes an unequal measure. It comes back to the idea, if I give you 10 and ask for 11 back, and only 10 of those things exist, I've just asked you to do the impossible. I've given you an unequal measure of human productive work. And this is, the crux of Christ's own words, judge not lest you be judged, which basically alludes to the fact that God has his own set of judgments, but if you choose to judge others and judge yourself with your own concept of law and its judgments, then you can only be expected to suffer the consequences of being judged under that very same system. You'd better start, and this is where repentance and so on comes into the idea of coming back under God. It's mankind's desire to create his own set of laws, to be a sovereign individual in determining laws for himself, as opposed to a creative force that is identified as either Saturn or God, who already has a perfect set of laws by right of creation. Do you see what I'm saying? The theology sort of makes sense on that?
Oh, absolutely. I know that in some of the work that I do when I'm doing coaching or I'm doing work with people, when it gets into heavy spiritual stuff, and we don't necessarily frame it like that. It's basically what the person's issue is. To me, it's like we're entering into a certain territory, and I see now why shadow work is so effective. And shadow work is basically taking, and this is coming now to me, it's taking the weights and measures that the person uses as their own God and applying it back to themselves. They don't realize they are doing, when somebody gets mad at somebody or can't forgive somebody, a lot of times when you back at it, apply it to self on how they're doing the same thing to somebody else, it has a tendency to neutralize, to balance, to go back to even, where they go, oh my gosh, I'm doing the same thing I'm accusing them of. So now we're back. It's almost like it's using the actual weights and measures of God, or the original weights and measures, where they go, oh, judge not lest you be judged, and then they find out how they're judging and how that's being judged against them, and it has a way of kind of canceling out effect. So going back to when people they use their own weights and measures, so to speak, how do we get back to the original weights and measures, and what are the original? Do we have any way of knowing what the original weights and measures are today?
Yes, we do. This in Saturn Death Cult, what I allude to is that obviously the fall, as portrayed in Genesis, when Adam and Eve are ejected from the garden and put into a world where they have to now, by the sweat of their own brow, make the earth yield its fruits. This corresponds to that moment in most mythology known as doomsday, where the golden age comes to an end. Again, at a later point we'll get into the actual cosmology to explain how this actually happened. But what happens as a result of doomsday is that, along with all the other key archetypes, these basic, just let me reach here, define what an archetype is so that people understand.
Please do, yes.
Okay, an archetype is I'm going to mispronounce this. It is a irreducible, is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying.
An archetype is an irreducible first form. It cannot be reduced to a more elementary state. All right, it's a concept that you cannot go further back. In connection with world mythology, it means the original idea or structure, whether it is a root idea behind the goddess image, the model of a good king, or a hero, or the ideal form of a sacred temple or a city. So archetypes are essentially the first cause, the first idea that comes into it. And what I argue in Saturn Death Cult is that a lot of these archetypes were triggered by actual cosmological events that were very natural, very much a part of the physical realms, but had such a hugely deep impact on people that it's something that has passed down through the years, almost like what geneticists refer to as racial memory, down through many, many generations. And the most frightening of these archetypes for humans was the doomsday, the idea of nearly being wiped out on the planet. It's the flip side to the golden age, the triggering of a golden age to re-enter, the death of a golden age followed by the triggering of a new golden age. The flip side to that is, of course, doomsday bringing down the first golden age, but a doomsday being the trigger, a new doomsday being the trigger of entry into a new golden age, a reborn human for those that survive it. And this doomsday archetype is the impetus for groups of people after the fall of the original golden age to start to attempt to codify, to record events as they were in the old golden age as a means to provide people with the mechanisms, a manual for rebuilding society after a great cataclysm. And it is this attempt which is altruistic at the beginning. It's what I call the Silver Age that follows the first golden age, and it's the age of priesthoods. And it is this attempt which, while altruistic, while very noble in its attempts at the beginning, is the event in human history that lays the seeds for a corrupting of this manual for rebuilding society in the image of what happened in the Golden Age. It lays the seeds for a corrupt interpretation of this manual, leading to the corrupt systems that we have today. And the reason that I put down to that, and again, this applies very much in psychological aspects, and that is this amazing ability of human beings to go to form a form of amnesia, to deal with hugely traumatic events. And we know this takes place in victims of sexual abuse and so on like that. But what's not really studied, except by certain psychologists who, some famous ones, Jung and Velikovsky, who was a psychologist by training. What's not really been taken to heart by people is the idea that humanity as a whole itself can enter into amnesia as a defense mechanism for the trauma that it would have suffered as a result of what has come down to us as doomsday. So we literally start, consigning the mythological record, which is supposedly a record to warn us that this could happen again. These are the problems. These are the things that we tried to keep alive for future generations to rebuild. It comes down to us. We look at it now and we say, what a bunch of gobbledygook. It can't possibly allude to anything real, because when I look up at the stars, Saturn is this little speck of light that we can hardly see. The same with all the other planets, and every day is like any other day. This leads us into this false sort of sense of security in our solar system as it stands, as we see it today. And it's not helped by the uniformitarian approach to history that says, you can tell the past by look around you today to see what it was like in the past, which is what the geological sciences and astrophysics and so on do. They extrapolate what they see today and assume it has always run this way in the past. But in fact, what we have is this idea that the ancients experienced a very different and very frightening sky to the one that we see today, that those experiences were all too real. But thanks to the efforts of the Silver Age priesthoods, we have a record that has been affected by this deep psychological amnesia and this tendency to treat this record as a fiction.
You've opened up a can of worms here. My mind's going all over the place, and I'm sure some of the listeners are too. So if it's okay, can we take some short snippets of that to kind of catch up before we go into the way that Saturn actually looked in the past as compared to how it looks now? Because I feel like that we're entering into that stage. I'd like to clear up and maybe get a deeper idea of some of the concepts you threw there. Let's start off with the archetype. As you were talking about the archetype being irreducible, that it can't reduce down any further, like you get down to gold and you can't really reduce gold down, and it's a base element, and the archetype is a base element that seems to be written in our genetics, in our heart.
It's a psychological base element.
It's a psychological base element, and so the idea of the hero's journey and things like that, they're wanting to get back to the golden age, that these are part of the original archetype weights and measures that we came with, or that were infused in us by the Spirit, by the divine?
Not exactly. The weights and measures, all right, that I believe were established in the Golden Age bear no relevance to the subsequent stories about what brought the Golden Age to its end. And this is the big problem, all right, is that in a very basic scenario, if we can accept that the solar system was very different to the ancients, what they saw taking place in the heavens, the interactions between planets, the sun, and so on, was the catalyst for bringing down this age that enjoyed the benefits of a system of rule of law that had been established at that time. And as a result of that, mythology records these cosmological events as the acts of gods, and that ultimately shows the gods as being very capricious in their attitudes towards humans, because humans are quite happily going about their business on Earth. They seem to be working very well with each other, observing certain laws. It is a golden age of human existence, the beginning of civilization, and suddenly it's brought to a cataclysmic end. And the only explanation has to be, in the minds of people where this extrapolates beyond the archetype, is that it is some sort of judgment that is brought down on humans as a result of possibly, as we were talking about Adam and Eve, as a result of violating a perfect law that was in existence before that cataclysm.
So the amnesia part of that you're talking about, wouldn't the 2012 deal, the 2000 Y2K, all these things that are put out in the media where we start to go, oh no, it's coming again, won't that trigger the amnesia in us in itself? Because we're, So it does trigger the amnesia, which then it makes us want to borrow more and spend more and kind of go into the unequal weights and measures.
Sure. Yeah, as I say, in terms of where we're at today, where we can use what I'm discussing in Saturn Death Cult is to understand the nature of the doomsday archetype and the role it plays in our deep psyche and how we approach things. This, of course, unfortunately, is something well understood by those who would seek to manipulate us. They're quite happy to exploit archetypes like the doomsday idea, but we have this deep-seated fear of a return to a chaos. We can't put our finger on it. We create films, we create stories that try to allude to it, whether it's horror movies, science fiction stuff, books of this kind of thing, and so on. But it's basically there from an event that took place in ancient times. It still plagues us. And yes, it does tend to steer us towards doing acts on an emotional level that is accessing this particular archetype rather than on a rational level. Make sense?
Yeah, so it's the other foot falling. Like a lot of times I'll go into, and it's stuff that I worked on with myself, but work on with a lot of people, is that, when things are going really good, they've got this, conspiracy within them where they're looking up, literally looking up, going, I'm looking up for the other foot to crush me or fall on me. And now I can see how this might have a parallel to exactly what you're talking about based on what was happening with the planets is different than what we see in our sky today. And so basically it sounds like what you're saying is this other foot falling, this catastrophe that we see constantly in the media, in the movie, is that this plays on several different aspects. One of them that might come from an actual history that happened within the skies, but it's also being played upon from the Saturn death cults too.
That culture that I call Saturn Death Cult utilizes this. Look, when was it, 2009 or was it 2008 when Henry Paulson, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, went to the American Congress and basically threatened them with doomsday? All right.
2008. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, 2008. If they didn't bail out the banks and the financial system, and even with the current system, the current problems that we're seeing in Europe, there's always this allusion to doomsday to get what these people want. Don't do this, and we'll have a doomsday, some kind of a thing. So it's a very powerful archetype to trigger in people's deep subconscious when trying to get what you actually want to have done. All I can say is that sorry, go for it, Mark.
I was going to say it in sales, that when people are sold in marketing, people say, well, I want to sell with positive attributes, and people and marketers will say, yeah, your ability to sell in positive attributes is going to be very minimal, because there's actually, it's like 3 to 4 times as powerful is coming from what they're worried about, this possible mini doomsday scenario happening within them, and they will do stuff that they will buy because of the promise of going away from it. And what I want to do is connect it to, it sounds like that what you're saying and what's happening is that this is, have you ever seen the movie Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court with Bing Crosby?
Oh, many years ago. Yep.
Many years ago. And the part where they were going to burn him, and then just at that perfect timing, somebody says, well, there happens to be an eclipse coming right now, and this time in history, a big eclipse, a full eclipse, and why don't you use it for your benefit to say, hey, look, if you don't let me go, I'm going to take the sun out. And they all start laughing at him, and then all of a sudden the eclipse starts happening, and they figure they better untie him, and he gets his freedom through that. But he's using an event that was going to happen in the sky anyways. But it seems like it's almost superstitious to say it happened at one time in history. It doesn't mean it's going to happen again. However, we know this affects people at a deep psychological, archetypical level. Let's use it for our benefit as best we can. Well,
in the Saturn Death Cult thesis, I argue in the second part of the book, the website, that a lot of the financial control that these groups have developed over time is backed up by the idea of, you don't do what we do, cataclysms will take place. They are purely, on a financial level. But what happens is that they present these arguments saturated in symbols, such as the all-seeing eye on the US dollar. Whenever I see in today's particular events, whenever I see the European Union people meeting, they have completely adapted the European Union symbol to look like an eye, a single all-seeing eye.
Yes.
There are reasons behind the use of these symbols, because symbols are the next step up from the archetype. The archetype is the idea. The symbol that we have in that is the expression of that idea. When they sit around talking about cataclysms and so on with an all-seeing eye, emblazoned on a wall behind them, or if it's in the American context, it's they're talking about that dollar you have in your pocket and what's going to happen to it. Take it out and you see the all-seeing eye on the pyramid there. They're appealing to this deep-rooted fear that humanity has brought down over, I believe, the last 4,000 years. This deep-rooted fear of actual cataclysmic cosmic calamity. And then they're couching it in terms of their financial system.
In magic, they've got something called sigil magic, which is basically when you get into a state or an emotion or a certain feeling, then they draw symbols that will remind them of what that is, so that symbol can then anchor them or stimulus response them back into the emotion that they want to use in magic rituals. So basically it sounds like they're using symbols and then creating a stimulus response anchor, a connection between the archetypical fear of doomsday and their symbols, and those symbols are a constant reminder that we should continue to use their system as a way not to have doomsday happen.
Precisely, because it's actually a deep-rooted trigger that says these guys have the authority. They know the symbols from a certain time before doomsday. They can protect us from another doomsday. It has that effect on people, and this sort of connection with sigil magic and so on. What we're seeing with the central bankers of the world, this is being done on a planetary-wide level. It's through all media. It's through, as I say, the bits of paper that you have in your pocket that form money, on your credit cards, the what you call them, the brand names, the logos of companies and so on, all have this kind of stuff linking in to this deep-seated fear of doomsday and doomsday's origins in the fall of the Golden Age.
Wow. So let me do a real quick flip for you. What I want to do is go into a planetary alignment in a minute. What I'd like to do is ask you one question, then go to a quick break, and then get into the planetary alignment that kind of puts this all together and gives a deep explanation. Let me hit you with the flip. How might it be, and that's a big question, how might it be if this wasn't happening? What might be a correct way to look at it, or what might the world be like without this right now?
How might it be?
Lined up correctly, should I say, with the proper weights and measures.
Oh, right. I've got you. Yeah. No, how might it be? A world of justice, based on equal and accurate weights and measures. In my opinion, a world where there is no financial system based on debt, as the issue of money, the interest system. Without these people, this is a world where each human being can trust the law in their dealings with every other human being, and has a basic, it doesn't matter what spiritual awareness another human being is, or lack of spiritual awareness somebody else is. What I'm alluding to is the idea of a world in which whatever your state of awareness is, when you come into deal with other people who are higher or lower, whatever in their consciousness, you all have common ground in which to trust each other. And essentially that leads to no need for war, no need for conflict, because law determines the way that we behave to one another, irrespective of our various spiritual awareness or cultures or whatever. I don't know if that helps.
Oh yeah, I think that's beautiful. I think what it what it says to me is that we do have this glitch in us because of the golden age that doesn't think about and doesn't worry about and trust that things will be taken care of, that it will be according to law. And that has kind of almost created a glitch in us. And the idea is that it's been used against us when, in fact, weights and measures was created to protect us.
Absolutely. And, just before we have that break and come back to the actual thing,
Sure.
The Golden Age.
Jeez.
What I would say is that in esoteric traditions, when you understand that they talk about a golden age, followed by silver age, a bronze age, and that we are currently living in an iron age with an attempt to get back into a new golden age, I think it is better for us to actually think in terms of, and this is largely a biblical Hebrew concept, and that is that golden age passes to silver, silver to bronze, bronze to iron, but what replaces it all is the compound of stone. And the way I would describe that is that what we can look forward to is not a new golden age, because gold is malleable and can be manipulated in shape and form, but an age in which that which was written in stone once again reasserts itself as the means by which we all interact with each other.
Yeah, I seem to remember some passage somewhere in the Bible where it says, I'll write my law or my word in your heart in stone and in the book.
Well, the writing of the law on the hearts, definitely the law of Moses was, of course, written on stone tablets. Those stone tablets were broken and such, very, very symbolic. What I'm actually referring to there is the prophecies of Daniel. Daniel openly uses the esoteric tradition of the progression of history being gold, silver, bronze, iron. And he talks about a time of iron and clay, but that it is replaced by a stone that basically grows and comes to fill the whole earth. And I personally believe that this has a lot to do with the surge in the last couple of 100 years, where we are looking back to all those monuments that litter the planet that seemed inexplicable 200 years ago, pyramids, temples, and so on like that. And within these various places and so on, we will find the correct weights, measures, laws, and so on encoded in those stones that will form the basis of whatever replaces, I'm being very hopeful here, but whatever replaces the implosion of the system that we are currently suffering under now.
Yeah, I remember reading a book years ago by Raymond E. Capt, I think his name was, about the pyramids.
Oh, yes. Yes, I know him.
And that's what he was seeking to go after, is that the British-American inch is within a hair's breadth of the pyramid inch, and those weights and measures. And I don't know if that ties in anywhere. Premise of a preacher I used to listen to years ago that used to read from his book and other books about the pyramid was that he believed that that's where the law was written in stone through weights and measures in stone.
Absolutely. No, I was just going to say that leads us nicely into, after the break, a lot of the work done by the pyramidologists associated with CAP and other pyramidologists and people like that who look into this. This is highly augmented by, it's almost like a missing key, is understanding the role, the actual physical role the planet Saturn played in determining a lot of these structures in those old days. So, that's where it takes us into, you've got to have a knowledge of a different kind of cosmology. You've got to drop that modern understanding of the solar system and take it at its word. A lot of what mythology tells us was seen in the skies in ancient times.
Wow, this is wonderful. Well, before we go to break, Troy, why don't you go ahead and give your website again so people can go to your website and check it out if they haven't already.
Sure. Yeah, SaturnDeathCult.com, one word, SaturnDeathCult.com. There is a Kindle version under the same title for those who have a Kindle, and for those who don't and want to read the Kindle version, you can download the Kindle software onto your computer. But the website and the book are largely the same. The book has some added information on the science of the planet Saturn, what's surrounding discoveries made on Saturn, and also a look at the fossilization of animals over time, a new interpretation of that. So a little bit of added value there, but SaturnDeathCult.com is where it all starts.
All right, Troy, thanks a lot, and let's take a quick break, and we'll be back in a minute.